Statistically, the Trinity doesn't add up. The biblical authors don't seem to be working from the framework of Trinitarianism. They seem to be working from the framework of Unitarianism, and this can be seen pretty clearly statistically. Now, the Trinity is the belief that God is composed of three persons and one essence, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that are co-eternal, co-equal, but they differ in their roles. But they all have the divine essence. Now, this definition is really important as we move forward to remember that God, in Trinitarianism, God is plural. He consists of three persons. So just keep this in mind as we move forward. Statistically, this just simply is not the understanding of God that the biblical authors seem to have. Now, since many scholars believe that the Trinity was revealed between the Testaments, aka in the person of Jesus Christ, that's when the Trinity was revealed, we're going to be really gracious and only look at the New Testament. Does the New Testament support the Trinity statistically? Now, the first line of evidence that really supports Unitarianism is that the Father is called God overwhelmingly more than any other member of the Trinity in the New Testament. Now, this is the biblical data. The Father is called God about 97% of the time. Jesus is called God about 1% of the time, maybe, in like John 20:28 and Hebrews 1:8. I don't interpret those passages that way, but I understand how somebody could say, yeah, Jesus is being called God here. But that's maybe 1% of the verses in the New Testament. The Holy Spirit is called God maybe 2% of the verses in like 1 Corinthians 3:16 and Acts 5:3-5. There's some places where the Holy Spirit is called God. Now, which framework explains this data better? Unitarianism, that God is just the Father, that the Spirit is part of who God is, and that the Son, Jesus, is the human Messiah, or Trinitarianism, that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are equally God? Which one better explains this data? That 97% of the time, the Father is called God. The second line of evidence is that only the term God the Father is used in the New Testament. The terms God the Son, God the Holy Spirit never occur. So what we see in the biblical data, God the Father, or God and Father, those terms occur 29 times in the New Testament. This can be seen in verses like Galatians 1:1, Philippians 2:11, etc. God the Son, or God and Son, occurs 0 times in the New Testament. God the Spirit, or God and Spirit, occurs 0 times in the New Testament. So which framework better explains this data? Unitarianism, that God is just the Father? Or Trinitarianism, that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Which one better explains that 100% of the time God the Father is used, or God and Father? Never once are those other terms used. The third line of evidence is that only singular parts of speech are used in relation to God in the New Testament. Now, when I'm referring to singular parts of speech, I'm talking about nouns and verbs and adjectives, all these different parts of speech. When they're used in relation to God, they're always singular every single time in the New Testament. We see from the biblical data that there's over 1,000 singular parts of speech used for God, or used in relation to God. This can be seen in Matthew 3:9, Luke 1:68, and Acts 10:40, and other places. We see 0 plural parts of speech used in relation to God. Now, which framework better explains this data? Unitarianism, that God is one singular being or person? Or Trinitarianism, that God is 3 persons? Which one better explains the thousands of singular pronouns and verbs used in relation to God? The fourth line of evidence is that God is never once called 3 or 3 in 1, but always called 1. This statistic is in regard to the entire Bible. Statistically, we see that the times that God is called 1, or that God is alone, is 28 times. This can be seen in Deuteronomy 32:39, Malachi 2:10, James 2:19, etc. 10 of different places God is called 1, or that he is God alone. Times that God is called 3, or 3 in 1, 0. There are 0 times in the entire Bible that God is called 3 or 3 in 1. Now, which framework better explains this? Unitarianism, that God is just one being? Or Trinitarianism, that God is 3 persons in one essence? Which one better explains that data? Now, these figures that I showed are absolutely shocking if God is a Trinity, composed of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Statistically, it seems that Trinitarianism was not the understanding that the biblical authors had, because in all these ways, the data overwhelmingly supports Unitarianism, much better than Trinitarianism. My plea to you Trinitarians is to let the majority interpret the minority rather than the other way around. We shouldn't use 1 or 2 verses here or there to build theology off of. We should use the majority to build our theology off of. and let those interpret the minority. As we've seen today, statistically, the God of the Bible is just the Father.